My name is Leo, and for the better part of 34 years, I've operated under the assumption that life, like a well-made cabinet, benefits from clean lines, solid joinery, and a distinct lack of drama. My world was one of 90-degree angles and predictable outcomes. I built custom furniture, renovated kitchens, and found a quiet satisfaction in bringing order to chaos. My apartment reflected this philosophy. Minimalist, functional, with every object in its designated place. It was a life built to be stable, not exciting. A fortress of quiet competence. This carefully curated piece was a direct response to the emotional shrapnel of my last relationship. Sarah. We had been together for 5 years, engaged for one. The end wasn't a fiery explosion. It was more like a slow leak, a quiet deflation of pressure until the whole thing just sagged and collapsed. Her parting words had been etched into the grain of my memory. "You're too safe, Leo," she'd said, not with anger, but with a kind of weary resignation. "You're my harbor, but I think I want the storm." She wanted the storm. I was the guy you came home to after the storm had passed, the one who would fix the metaphorical roof and make sure the foundation was sound. I was dependable. I was solid. I was in her final, devastating assessment boring. The accusation didn't make me angry. It just made me tired, because on some level, I knew she was right. I had mistaken caution for wisdom, and in doing so, had built a life so secure it had become a cage. So I retreated further into my work, into the tangible certainty of wood and stone, where things either fit or they didn't. There were no gray areas. My life was a repeating, comfortable pattern. Wake at 6, run 3 miles, shower, coffee, workshop until 6, dinner, read, sleep. Weekends were for bigger projects or quiet solitude. It was a level, well-sanded existence. Then on a Tuesday that felt exactly like every other Tuesday, there was a knock on my door. It was a hesitant, almost apologetic knock, not the confident rap of a delivery driver or the frantic drumming of a neighbor in crisis. I opened the door to Clara. She lived in 3B, the apartment directly across the hall. We'd moved in around the same time, 6 months ago, but our interactions had been limited to polite nods in the hallway and the occasional shared grimace in a stalled elevator. I knew she was a landscape designer because I'd once helped her carry a rogue Japanese maple up the stairs. That was the extent of our history. Now, she stood in my doorway, looking like a corner strategist. Her hands were shoved into the pockets of her jeans, and her shoulders were tense, pulled up towards her ears. Her hair, a cascade of dark waves that always seemed to be fighting a losing battle with gravity, was pulled back in a messy knot. But it was her eyes that held my attention. They were a deep, clear green, and right now, they were filled with a potent mixture of desperation and steely resolve. She wasn't asking for a cup of sugar. "Leo," she began, her voice low and direct, "I have a completely insane, probably inappropriate, and highly inconvenient favor to ask you." I leaned against the doorframe, my curiosity piqued. That's a compelling sales pitch. A small, wry smile touched her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I need you to pretend to be my boyfriend." I blinked. Of all the possible requests, a dead car battery, a heavy piece of furniture, a spider in the bathtub, this was not on the list. I waited for the punchline, for the part where she explained this was some elaborate prank. It didn't come. She just stood there, her gaze unwavering, waiting for my response to a proposition that had just shattered the predictable tranquility of my Tuesday. "Okay," I said, a word that seemed to exit my mouth of its own volition. "For how long?" "One dinner," she said, relief visibly washing over her features, loosening the tension in her shoulders by a fraction. "Just tonight. 7 o'clock. My place." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. I saw past the frantic energy of her request and noticed the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes. I saw the strength in the set of her jaw, a silent declaration that she was a woman who solved her own problems, and asking for help was a last resort. Sarah had accused me of being a harbor. Maybe for one night, that wasn't such a bad thing to be. "What for dinner?" I asked. That time, her smile was real. It transformed her face, lighting it from within. I have no idea, she admitted. I've been too busy panicking to cook. Right, I said, nodding slowly. The boyfriend. What does he do? What's his name? His name is Leo, she said, a spark of humor finally kindling in her green eyes. And he's about to find out. She invited me in, and I crossed the threshold from my sanctuary of order into her world of beautiful, vibrant chaos. Her apartment was the antithesis of mine. Books were stacked on every available surface, sketches of garden layouts were taped to the walls, and plants of every shape and size spilled from pots, creating a miniature indoor jungle. It was messy, but it was alive. The air smelled of damp soil and charcoal pencils. It was the smell of creation. We sat on her couch, a comfortable, overstuffed piece of furniture that was probably a decade older than I was, a stark contrast to my own sleek, unforgiving leather sofa. A bottle of wine and 2 glasses materialized on the coffee table, which was currently buried under a pile of seed catalogs. Okay, she said, pouring the wine with a slightly shaky hand. Operation. Convince the tyrant I've moved on. Codename, anything but Julian. Julian is the tyrant. I asked, taking the glass she offered. Julian is my ex, she clarified, taking a healthy swallow of her wine. We dated for 2 years. He's a real estate developer. He thinks because he develops properties, he can develop people, too. He was always trying to renovate me. She used the word with a self-aware irony that made me smile. He couldn't accept that we were over. He still calls, still texts, still shows up with thoughtful gifts that are really just markers of his territory. He invited himself to my housewarming dinner tonight. A dinner, I might add, to which only 2 other friends are coming. So he's trying to reestablish a foothold, I surmised. Exactly. He sees this apartment as a temporary setback, not a permanent relocation. He thinks I'll eventually come to my senses and move into the Bayesian glass box he picked out for us. So, I need to present him with an immovable object. A new foundation that he can't bulldoze. She gestured at me with her wine glass. You, Leo, are the new foundation. I took a sip of the wine. It was good. I feel like I should be made of sterner stuff. Concrete, maybe. Don't worry, she said, her eyes twinkling. You have a quiet solidity. It'll be very convincing. Her choice of words, quiet solidity, landed differently than Sarah's safe. From Sarah, it had been an accusation of being static. From Clara, it sounded like a compliment, like a strength. So, we need a backstory, I said, shifting into a more practical mode. How'd we meet? How long have we been together? What do I do for a living? Well, we met in the elevator, she began, her mind clearly already working. It was stuck. For a whole hour. Very romantic. An hour in that shoebox? That sounds more like a hostage situation, I countered. Fina. We met at the hardware store. In the aisle for wood stains. You were explaining the subtle differences between walnut and mahogany to a very confused college student. I was captivated by your passion for polyurethane. I laughed, a genuine, unforced sound that felt foreign in my own chest. That is terrifyingly plausible. What about my job? You're a carpenter. A furniture maker, she said without hesitation. You build things that last. It's a perfect thematic counterpoint to Julian, who builds luxury condos that all look the same. Her perception was unnerving. She'd somehow intuited the very core of my professional life from a handful of hallway encounters. You're good at this, I noted. I'm a designer, she replied with a shrug. I create narratives for spaces. This is just a narrative for a person. So, we've been dating for 3 months. It's new but serious. We're taking it slow, but we both know it's something special. You make me laugh. I make you try new vegetables. I like vegetables, I said defensively. You eat the same 3 vegetables on rotation, Leo. I've seen your grocery deliveries. Broccoli, carrots, and the occasional roe bell pepper. It's time for you to experience the thrill of Swiss chard. Esther de Hair. She noticed my grocery deliveries. She paid attention to details, tiny, insignificant details. Sarah had once confessed, after 2 years of dating, that she wasn't sure what my favorite color was. Clara knew about my vegetable habits after 6 months of being strangers. What else? I asked, my voice a little quieter than before. You're quiet, but you're observant. You don't talk a lot, but when you do, it's thoughtful. You're not intimidated by him, but you're not aggressive. You're just there. A fact. Unimpeachable. She looked at me. Her expression serious now. Can you do that? Can you just be a fact? The request was strangely profound. All my life, I'd felt like a footnote, a supporting character. Sarah had wanted a leading man, a hero with a grand narrative. Clara was asking me to be something much simpler and, somehow, much more powerful. A fact. A truth that couldn't be argued away. I think I can manage that, I said. We spent the next hour building our fictional relationship. We decided on a first date, a walk through an architectural salvage yard. Our first fight, a heated debate over the merits of open shelving in kitchens, which felt alarmingly real, and the little domestic details that make a relationship feel lived in. She told me I had a habit of leaving sawdust on my socks. I told her she hummed, slightly off-key, when she was concentrating on a sketch. We were weaving a story, but it was threaded with strands of truth, observations we'd made about each other from across the hall. The line between performance and reality began to blur before the curtain had even gone up. Her other friends arrived, a cheerful couple named Marcus and Becca, who were immediately let in on the ruse. Becca, a sharp-witted lawyer, clapped her hands in delight. "Oh, this is so much better than game night. I want front-row seats for the downfall of Julian the Terrible." Marcus, a laid-back high school teacher, just shook my hand warmly. "Good luck, man. You're a brave soul." The five of us were sharing a bottle of wine and some appetizers when the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp, imperious. A wave of tension immediately rolled through the room. Clara's easy smile tightened. She took a deep breath, looked at me, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Showtime." I stood beside her as she opened the door. Julian was exactly what I had pictured. He was tall, dressed in clothes that were aggressively casual, a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my table saw, perfectly distressed jeans, and shoes that looked expensive and uncomfortable. He had the kind of handsome, symmetrical face that seemed machine-tooled for success, and a smile that didn't involve his eyes in the slightest. "Clara, darling," he said, his voice a smooth baritone. He leaned in to kiss her cheek, but she subtly turned her head so his lips met the air an inch from her skin. He didn't seem to notice, or chose not to. His eyes swept over her apartment with a look of faint disapproval before landing on me. "And you are?" he asked, his tone implying the question was a formality he was forced to endure. Clara slid her hand into mine. Her palm was cool, but her grip was firm. It was a jolt, a sudden anchor in the strange theatricality of the moment. "Julian, this is Leo," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Leo, my boyfriend." I held out my other hand. "Nice to meet you." He took it, his grip a brief, firm squeeze designed to assert dominance. It was a corporate handshake, a closing tactic. "Julian, so, you're the neighbor," he said neighbor like it was a slightly embarrassing condition, like a rash. "I am," I said, keeping my voice level. "Convenient, isn't it?" His smile faltered for a split second. He wasn't used to people being unruffled by his presence. He was a force of nature designed to intimidate, and I was just a rock sitting in his path. A fact. Dinner was a masterclass in passive aggression, with Julian as the professor emeritus. He dominated the conversation, steering it towards his recent triumphs. A new luxury high-rise, a vacation to an absurdly exclusive resort, a car that cost as much as a small house. Marcus and Becca did their best to deflect and redirect, but Julian was a heat-seeking missile for his own ego. He kept trying to draw Clara into conversations about their shared past, referencing inside jokes she didn't acknowledge and memories she didn't seem to share. "Remember that little bistro in Paris, darling? The one with the terrible service, but that incredible Coke au vin." "I remember the terrible service," Clara said flatly, taking a sip of her wine. Julian then turned his attention to me. "So, Leo, Clara tells me you work with your hands." He said it with the tone of someone admiring a particularly clever dog. "What is it you do, exactly?" "Custom birdhouses." Becca snorted into her napkin. Marcus suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. I felt a familiar, hot prickle of shame. It was the same condescension Sarah's father, a wealthy investment banker, had always used with me. The implication was clear. Real men move markets. They didn't get their hands dirty. My work was a quaint hobby, not a profession. But then I looked at Clara. She was watching me, her expression a mixture of anger on my behalf and trust. She wasn't jumping in to defend me. She was waiting, trusting me to handle it. She was trusting me to be the man she described. Solid, unimpeachable. I put down my fork and met Julian's gaze. I build furniture, I said calmly. And I renovate spaces. I take things that are old or broken and make them useful again. I find the potential in things that other people overlook. I let my eyes drift around Clara's apartment, a silent statement. Like this building, most developers would have torn it down. But it has good bones, great light, solid construction. Someone just needed to see the potential. The subtext hung in the air, thick and unavoidable. I wasn't just talking about the building. Julian's smile was gone. He saw the move for what it was, a quiet, surgical strike that had reframed his insult into a defense of Clara's choices and, by extension, her choice of me. He had tried to paint me as a simple laborer, and I had repositioned myself as a man of vision and substance, qualities he prided himself on. Checkmate. For the first time all evening, Julian was silent. Becca raised her glass in a subtle toast. Well said, Leo. This building has character. Something you don't find in those glass towers downtown. The jab at Julian's profession was deliberate and perfectly timed. The rest of the dinner passed with a new dynamic. The power had shifted. Julian was more subdued, his attempts to control the evening now seeming desperate rather than dominant. He left early, making a vague excuse about a conference call with Hong Kong. The moment the door closed behind him, a collective sigh of relief filled the apartment. Becca turned to me, her eyes shining. I find a potential in things that other people overlook, Leo. That was magnificent. I may have it embroidered on a pillow. I felt a flush of warmth creep up my neck. I wasn't used to praise, especially not for my words. My value was in what I could build, not what I could say. After Marcus and Becca left, a comfortable silence settled between Clara and me as we cleared the table. We worked together easily, moving around each other in the small kitchen with an unspoken rhythm. It felt less like the end of a performance and more like the end of a long day. Natural. When we were done, she leaned against the counter, drying a wine glass with a linen towel. The frantic energy from earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet thoughtfulness. Thank you, she said, her voice soft. You were exactly what I needed. Just being a fact, I said, trying for levity. She looked up at me, her green eyes serious. You weren't just a fact, Leo. You were, well, you were incredible. What you said to Julian about the building, she paused, searching for the right words. You don't just see the surface of things, do you? You see how they're built, the structure underneath. People, too. There it was, the moment of being seen. It hit me with the force of a physical blow. Sarah had looked at me and seen a finished product, a piece of furniture that was sturdy but unexciting. She never once cared to look at the joinery, to understand how it was put together. Clara had seen it in one evening. She had seen the part of me that I valued most, the part one thought was invisible to everyone else. I managed to say, my throat suddenly tight. He really got to you with that work with your hands comment, she observed. It wasn't a question. I nodded, looking down at my own hands. They were calloused, with a few nicks and a faint layer of wood stain under the nails that never quite washed away. They were the hands of a craftsman, not a CEO. It's an old insecurity, I admitted. My ex-fiancé's family. They were of a similar mindset. The storm she wanted wasn't you, Clara said quietly, and my head snapped up. How could she know that? Had I mentioned it? No, of course I hadn't. I'm sorry, she said quickly, seeing my surprise. I'm overstepping. It's none of my business. How did you know? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Because Julian is the same, she explained, her gaze not leaving mine. He wants a hurricane. Someone loud and impressive and dramatic. But hurricanes leave a mess. They don't build anything. They just tear things down. She put the wine glass down on the counter with a soft click. Some people prefer the man who knows how to rebuild. We stood there in the quiet of her kitchen, the air charged with everything that hadn't been said. The pretense of our arrangement had dissolved, leaving something raw and real in its place. This wasn't about Julian anymore. It might never have been. It was about two people who had been profoundly misunderstood, standing across a kitchen island and seeing each other with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I should have gone home then. I should have said goodnight, retreated to my quiet, orderly apartment, and processed this unexpected turn of events. But I didn't want to. I wanted to stay in her beautiful, chaotic world, where I felt more seen than I had in years. "The play is over," I said, stating the obvious. "The tyrant has been vanquished. For now," she said, a small, tired smile on her face. "He's persistent. This might have just been Act 1 inch. An idea, bold and uncharacteristic, formed in my mind. Then maybe the play needs a longer run." Her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Are you suggesting an extension of your contract, Mr. Boyfriend?" "I'm suggesting that maybe you could use a reliable foundation for a little while longer," I said, the words feeling clumsy and brave at the same time. "And maybe I wouldn't mind the work." She studied my face for a long moment, her green eyes searching for something. I wasn't sure what she found, but her expression softened, the last of her defensive posture melting away. "Okay, Leo the carpenter," she said softly. "Let's see what we can build." The days that followed fell into a strange and wonderful new pattern. The pretend relationship became our running joke, a flimsy excuse for a connection that was rapidly becoming anything but. We didn't define it. We didn't lay out rules or expectations. We just let it be. It started with small things. I'd be in my workshop, the scent of cedar shavings filling the air, and there would be a soft knock on the door. It would be Clara, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Boyfriend fuel," she'd announce with a grin. She would perch on a stool, careful not to get dust on her clothes, and watch me work. She never seemed bored. She asked questions about dovetail joints and the properties of different woods. She saw the art in my craft, not just the labor. In return, I found myself drawn into her world. I'd wander over to her apartment to find her surrounded by sketches, her brow furrowed in concentration. She'd talk me through her designs for a public park or a private garden, explaining her choice of plants, the flow of the pathways, the way the light would hit a certain tree in the late afternoon. I, who had only ever seen a tree as a source of lumber, began to see it as a piece of living sculpture. She taught me a new language, one of light and shadow, texture and color. One Saturday, I found her on her balcony, wrestling with a series of large, heavy planters. "I'm creating a vertical herb garden," she explained, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "It's for us, for our fake cooking." "Our fake cooking could use some real basil," I agreed, and without another word, I went back to my apartment and returned with my drill and a box of heavy-duty wall anchors. We spent the afternoon working together under the warm sun. My practical knowledge of structure and her artistic vision combined perfectly. I made sure the planters were secure, that they could bear the weight of soil and water. She arranged them in a way that was not only functional but beautiful, a cascade of terracotta and green against the brick wall. Our hands brushed as we reached for the same tool. A jolt, just like the first time she'd taken my hand. We both froze for a fraction of a second, the air crackling with unspoken energy. Then the moment passed, and we went back to work, the silence between us now filled with a different kind of weight. We were building something tangible, this herb garden, but it felt like a metaphor for what was happening between us. We were taking the raw materials of our separate lives and creating something new, something that could grow. Just as we were planting the last of the parsley, a shadow fell over us. I looked up to see Julian standing in the doorway to her balcony. He hadn't knocked. He'd just let himself in, a violation that was so typical of him, it was almost cliché. He was holding a large, ornate orchid in a ridiculously expensive pot. It was a sterile, hothouse beauty, a stark contrast to the living, useful herbs we had been planting. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth as polished granite. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought your new place could use a touch of elegance." He placed the orchid on her small balcony table, where it looked completely out of place, like a society woman at a barn dance. His eyes fell on me, my hands covered in dirt, my t-shirt stained with sweat. He looked at the drill lying on the ground. His lip curled in a faint sneer. "Still playing handyman. I see." He dismissed me with a glance and turned his full attention back to Clara. "Darling, I've been thinking. That gallery opening we were supposed to go to next month? I still have the tickets. We should go. For old time's sake." Clara stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her jeans. Her movements were deliberate, calm. There was no panic in her eyes this time, only a cold, clear anger. "Julian," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "First, you don't happen to be in the neighborhood. This is not on your way to anywhere. Second, you don't walk into my home uninvited. Ever. And third, there is no we." She picked up the orchid. It must have been heavy, but she held it with ease. She walked over to him and held it out. "Take this. This is not a gift. It's an invoice. It's a bill for your own expectations, and I am not going to pay it." Julian was stunned into silence. He was used to arguments, to tears, to drama he could manipulate. He was not used to this unwavering, impenetrable calm. "Leo and I are building something here," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "We're planting herbs. We're putting down roots. You are rewriting a history that's already over. Please leave, and leave the key you clearly made a copy of." Her words hung in the air. "Leo and I are building something here." She had said we, not as part of the act, but as a statement of fact. She had defended me. Yes, but more than that, she had defended us. This fragile, undefined thing between us. She had claimed it. In front of him. In front of me. Julian stared at her, his handsome face a mask of disbelief. He looked from her to me, as if trying to solve a complex equation that didn't make sense. He saw a man in a dirty t-shirt and a woman with soil under her fingernails, and he could not comprehend why they would be chosen over him and his world of sterile elegance. He took the orchid, turned without another word, and left. This time, the silence he left behind wasn't one of relief. It was thick, electric, buzzing with the aftershock of her declaration. We stood on the balcony, surrounded by the scent of fresh soil and crushed mint. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the city. The boundary between our fake relationship and whatever this was had been irrevocably breached. The pretense was a pile of rubble at our feet. "You kept a copy of his key?" I asked, breaking the silence. She winced. I didn't know he had one. He must have made it. Control. That was always his thing. She looked at her hands, then at the herb garden. "I'm sorry you had to be a part of that." "Don't be," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "Clara, what you said about us building something." She finally looked at me, her green eyes wide and vulnerable. "It was true," she whispered. "Wasn't it?" I didn't answer right away. I stepped closer to her, into her space. The air was warm between us. I could smell the earth on her skin. I reached out and gently brushed a stray smudge of dirt from her cheekbone with my thumb. Her skin was soft. She didn't pull away. Her breath hitched. "Yes," I said, my voice low. "It was." That night, the unspoken tension was a third person in the room. We ordered pizza, unable to muster the energy to cook. We sat on our comfortable couch, a respectable distance between us, and watched an old black and white movie. But neither of us was paying attention. My awareness was entirely focused on her, on the way she tucked her feet up under her, the way she chewed on her lower lip when a scene was particularly tense, the faint scent of lavender and soil that clung to her. I was a man who craved order, who built his life on predictable patterns. But every predictable impulse in my body was screaming at me to break the pattern, to close the distance between us, to find out if the energy that crackled in the air was real. But the ghost of Sarah's voice was there, too, whispering that I was the safe choice, the harbor. What if this, too, was just a reaction to Julian? What if she just needed a port in the storm, and once the waters were calm, she would set sail again, looking for her own adventure? The fear of being a placeholder was a cold weight in my chest. The movie ended. The credits rolled in silence. Clara finally turned to me, her face illuminated by the flickering light of the screen. "Leo," she began, her voice barely audible over the movie's score. "That dinner, the first night, was that all just an act for you? When you defended my home, when you stood up to him, was that pretend?" Her question was a scalpel, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. She never wasted time with ambiguity. It was one of the things that terrified and fascinated me about her. "No," I said, the word coming out with more force than I intended. "None of it was. And today?" She pressed, her gaze unwavering. "On the balcony? Especially not today." The confession hung in the air between us. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, chaotic rhythm that was completely at odds with the quiet stillness of the room. I had spent years building walls around myself, and this woman had dismantled them in a matter of days, not with a sledgehammer, but with a simple, perceptive question. "I've spent the last 2 years," I began, the words tumbling out, clumsy and unpolished, believing that being quiet and steady was a flaw, that it made me boring, uninteresting. My last relationship ended because I wasn't enough of a storm. I was just the guy who knew how to fix things. I looked at my hands again, the hands that Julian had mocked. I thought that's all people saw. The handyman, the safe bet. I finally dared to look back at her. "But you saw the structure. You saw how I was built. I've never had anyone see that before." My confession felt raw, exposed. I had laid my biggest insecurity at her feet, and I half expected her to look at me with pity, to confirm my deepest fears. Instead, her expression softened with an empathy that was so profound it made my throat ache. She didn't say anything. She simply moved, closing the few feet of distance that separated us on the couch. She didn't stop until her knee was brushing against mine. She reached out not for my hand, but for my wrist. She turned my hand over, palm up, and traced the calluses with her fingertips. Her touch was light as a feather, but it sent a shock wave through my entire system. "These hands don't just fix things, Leo," she said, her voice a low murmur. "They create. They build. There's a world of difference." And then she leaned in. The kiss wasn't a firework display. It wasn't the dramatic, movie-ending climax that Sarah had probably dreamed of. It was quiet. It was certain. It was a confirmation of everything that had been building between us, a silent conversation that finally had a voice. Her lips were soft, and she tasted of wine and the salty pizza we'd shared. It was a kiss that felt like coming home to a place I hadn't known I was searching for. I brought my other hand up to cup her face, my thumb stroking her jawline. I felt the tension drain out of her, out of both of us. The performance was over. The pretense was gone. This was real. When we finally broke apart, we just looked at each other, our faces inches apart. Her green eyes were dark, luminous in the dim light. "So," she whispered, a small, shaky smile playing on her lips. "I guess the play is officially over." "I think it's just the intermission," I whispered back. "And I'm not ready to go home yet." She laughed, a soft, happy sound that filled the quiet room. "Good," she said, leaning her forehead against mine, "because I was thinking of signing you on for a permanent role." The first real date felt both monumental and completely unnecessary. We had already been more intimate, emotionally, than I had been with Sarah in 5 years. But we needed a marker, a conscious decision to step out of the strange, accidental courtship we'd fallen into and into something deliberate. I let her choose the venue. I expected a nice restaurant, maybe a walk in the park. Instead, she chose a sprawling, dusty architectural salvage yard on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was a graveyard of buildings, a beautiful, chaotic collection of forgotten things. There were rows of ornate fireplace mantels, mountains of reclaimed lumber, and acres of stained glass windows leaning against each other like weary old friends. It was perfect. We spent hours wandering through the aisles, our fingers tracing the history etched into wood and iron. I was in my element, pointing out the craftsmanship in a hand-carved newel post, explaining the difference between quarter-sawn oak and simple pine. She didn't just listen, she absorbed it, asking questions that showed she was truly seeing what I was seeing. She, in turn, showed me the beauty I would have missed. She ran her hand over a patch of moss growing on a stone gargoyle, admiring its texture. She pointed out the way the afternoon light filtered through a dusty cobalt blue window, casting patterns on the concrete floor. She saw the potential for life in these discarded objects. "Look at this," she said, her voice hushed with reverence. She was standing in front of a set of massive, weathered cypress doors, their iron hardware rusted and green with age. Imagine the garden these could open up to. Something wild and secret. I looked at the doors, and then I looked at her. Her face was smudged with dust, her hair was a mess from the wind, and she was, without a doubt, the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, because she saw the story in things. She saw the potential. "I think you could build a whole world behind doors like that," I said. She turned to me, her eyes shining. "Maybe we could." That was the moment the future cracked open, just a little. The word we felt different now. It wasn't a prop for Julian's benefit. It was a blueprint. Later, sitting on a pile of reclaimed beams and sharing a thermos of coffee I brought, we started to talk about the past. Not in vague terms, but with the kind of honesty that can only come after you've decided to trust someone. I told her everything about Sarah, about the slow, creeping realization that I was a disappointment to her, about feeling like a piece of comfortable, boring furniture in the vibrant, exciting life she wanted to build. She wanted a showpiece, I concluded, staring into my coffee cup, and I was built for daily use. Clara listened without interruption. When I was finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Showpieces are cold, and they're for other people to look at. Things that are built for daily use, they're the things that make a house a home. They're the things you can't live without." Then she told me about Julian. It wasn't just that he was controlling, it was that he saw her as a project. He loved her talent, but only as it reflected on him. He'd try to refine her designs, pushing her towards a more commercial, sterile aesthetic that was his taste, not hers. He'd bought her clothes in colors he preferred, tried to change the way she wore her hair, and criticized her friends as being unambitious. He didn't want a partner, she said, her voice laced with the memory of old frustrations. He wanted a subsidiary of his own corporation. He wanted to acquire my life and rebrand it. We sat there in that salvage yard, two people who had been put on shelves by the people who were supposed to love us most. He saw her as something to be molded. She saw me as something that was already finished, and therefore stagnant. But here, together, we felt like works in progress. We were both just finding our potential. The days turned into weeks. The line between my apartment and hers ceased to exist. My spare drill found a permanent home in her toolbox. Her favorite mug, a chipped ceramic thing with a painting of a grumpy-looking owl, became my default coffee cup. I'd wake up early and find her asleep on my couch, surrounded by sketches, and I'd cover her with a blanket and make coffee, letting her sleep. She started leaving groceries in my fridge, exotic things like purple carrots and Romanesco broccoli, a silent, playful challenge to my culinary routine. Our lives were merging, not with a grand announcement, but in 1,000 tiny, domestic ways. It was an integration so natural, so seamless, that I barely noticed it was happening. One evening, I came back from my workshop, tired and covered in sawdust, and walked straight into her apartment without thinking. She was cooking dinner, humming her slightly off-key tune. She didn't even look up. "You're late, boyfriend," she said, pointing a wooden spoon at me. "Your fake dinner is getting cold." I stopped in the doorway, a wave of profound contentment washing over me. This was it. This was the life that happened between the big, dramatic moments. This was the quiet, sturdy, everyday thing I'd always wanted but never knew how to build for myself. I walked over to her, wrapped my arms around her waist from behind, and rested my chin on her shoulder. She leaned back against me, still stirring the pot on the stove. "It's not fake anymore, is it?" I murmured into her hair. She turned her head, her cheek brushing against mine. "It never was, Leo," she said softly. "Not really. We just needed an excuse to see what was already there. 1 year later, the air smelled of fresh paint, lemon polish, and the rich, loamy scent of the garden drifting in through the open French doors. Our house, our actual, real house that we'd bought and renovated together, was filled with the warm hum of conversation and laughter. We were hosting our first real dinner party, a housewarming. It was a small, unassuming bungalow on the edge of town, a place that most people, including a developer like Julian, would have considered a teardown. But we had seen its potential. It had good bones. For the past 6 months, we had poured every spare moment into it. I had rebuilt the kitchen from scratch with cabinets made of reclaimed maple from a defunct bowling alley. I'd laid new floors, refinished the original trim, and built bookshelves into every conceivable nook. Clara had transformed the overgrown, neglected yard into a breathtaking landscape. She designed a stone patio, winding pathways, and garden beds that bloomed with a carefully orchestrated riot of color and texture. It was our combined vision, a perfect synthesis of structure and life, of stability and wildness. I stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter I had built, and watched her. She was moving through the living room, a glass of wine in her hand, talking to Marcus and Becca. She was laughing, her face animated and bright. She caught my eye from across the room, and her smile widened, a secret, private message just for me. This scene felt like a bookend to that first, terrifying dinner party. The context was the same, a gathering of friends in a new home. But the feeling was entirely different. There was no tension, no pretense, no antagonist waiting to undermine us. There was only a deep, abiding sense of peace, of rightness. Later, after the last guest had gone, we stood in the quiet kitchen, just as we had that first night. The comfortable mess of a successful party surrounded us. Dirty plates were stacked by the sink, wine glasses dotted the countertops, and a single, half-eaten piece of cake sat on a plate. Clara came up behind me and wrapped her arms around my waist, mirroring the gesture I had made in her apartment kitchen so many months ago. She rested her head against my back. Well, she sighed contentedly. No tyrants were vanquished this evening. No, I said, covering her hand with mine. Just a few bottles of wine. We stood there for a long time, just breathing together, listening to the house settle around us. It was a good sound, the sound of something solid, something built to last. I'm glad we never officially called it off, she murmured against my shirt. The whole boyfriend thing. I turned in her arms to face her, cupping her face in my hands. The same hands she had traced that first night, the hands that had built so much of the room we were standing in. I looked around at the warm, inviting space, at the open doors that led to her beautiful garden, at the life we were creating. It was never pretend, Clara, I said, my voice thick with an emotion I no longer try to hide. From the moment you opened your door, it was the realest thing in my life. She leaned up and kissed me, a slow, sweet kiss that tasted of wine and cake and the promise of 1,000 more quiet, perfect nights just like this one. It was a kiss that said everything. It said, I see you. I choose you. This is our home. And I finally understood. I wasn't the harbor. I wasn't the storm. I was the house, the foundation, the place she could always come back to. And with her, it was the only place I ever wanted to be. Have you ever found yourself in a situation that started as one thing and turned into something completely real? Tell me about a time you took a risk that paid off in the comments below. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next.